Have you ever been like totally lost in a movie, sitting there in the dark, and just thought, how did they do that? How did they build this whole world, this story that just grabs millions of people?
Hmm.
It feels like there's some secret sauce, you know? Maybe a hidden blueprint or something?
It definitely can feel like magic, like this art form only a select few really get.
Totally. And, well, before a certain point, that was kind of true, wasn't it? Screenwriting felt, well, pretty mysterious.
Yeah.
But today, we're going to pull back the curtain a bit. We're doing a deep dive into the ideas of the person who didn't just write about screenwriting. He pretty much wrote the book, the one they call the Bible of screenwriting.
We're talking about Sid Field and his really foundational book, Screenplay, The Foundations of Screenwriting.
That's the one. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack his main ideas, get a handle on this simple but really powerful framework he came up with, and figure out why it became such a standard in Hollywood. We want to help you see past the magic and understand the actual structure behind so many films.
Sid Field's impact, it really was revolutionary. You have to understand, before him, screenwriters were often just figuring things out. Intuition, trial and error.
Looking at what worked before.
Yeah, analyzing films, but without a common language, no clear guide. It was much more nebulous.
Sounds chaotic, like trying to build, I don't know, an IKEA cabinet without the instructions, or maybe without even agreeing on what a screwdriver is called.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. Field changed that. He essentially demystified the whole thing, turned screenwriting from this sort of inaccessible art into something you could actually teach, a craft.
With steps and tools you could define.
Exactly. You provided a concrete, step-by-step approach.
And it's stuck. For, what, over 40 years now, his framework's been that hidden blueprint. Sometimes people follow it to the letter. Sometimes it's just baked into how they think about story. Behind so many successful movies. Classics like The Godfather, even animated hits like Toy Story.
It gave people that much-needed roadmap.
Okay, so let's dig into that. This shift he caused. What exactly was so revolutionary? What did he introduce?
Well, like we said, the big problem was the lack of a shared language for structure. Field's genius was giving the industry that common language and, crucially, a visual model to go with it.
Ah, the paradigm.
The paradigm, yeah.
That's the diagram, right? The visual of the three-act structure.
Exactly that. It's simple, but incredibly powerful as a visual, and it caught on fast. It became the shorthand.
So everyone involved, writers, producers, execs, could suddenly talk about the story structure using the same term.
Pointing to the same parts of the process. Okay, we need to strengthen plot point I, or what's the midpoint here?
That's huge for collaboration, isn't it? Not just a writer's tool.
Oh, absolutely critical. That shared vocabulary makes communication, feedback, development, everything so much more efficient. It's not just the overall paradigm, either. He also defined these key milestones within the structure, specific beats the story needed to hit.
Plot points.
Plot points, exactly. We'll get more into those.
And the book itself, Screenplay, just took off.
Completely. Became the best-selling screenwriting book ever, and still is. It really earned that nickname, the Bible.
Okay, so method, language, map, milestones. Let's start with the backbone. The three-act structure, we hear that term all the time, but how did Field define it?
Field's core argument was pretty straightforward. Every effective screenplay is built on 3 distinct acts, and each act has a specific job to do in moving the story forward.
Like 3 stages of the journey. Makes sense.
Right. So, first up, Act 1, the setup.
Okay.
This is your beginning.
Yeah.
Introduce the world, the main character, the protagonist, what their normal life looks like. And you need to introduce or hint at the problem or desire that's going to drive the whole story.
How long is this part, usually?
Field suggested roughly the first 25% of the script. So in a typical 120-page screenplay, that's about, say, 30 pages.
And somewhere in there, early on, you get the inciting incident.
Yes, that's key. Often around page 10, 15, somewhere in there. It's the event that shatters the protagonist's ordinary world. It's what really kicks the story into motion.
Like Luke Skywalker getting R2-D2's message in Star Wars. His uncle buying the droids sets things up, but that holographic plea, that changes everything.
Exactly. Or Neo getting that mysterious phone call in The Matrix. His normal hacker life is over at that point. Act I does all that setup and leads directly to the first major turning point.
Which is plot point 1.
Correct. Plot point 1.
And that pushes us into Act 2, confrontation, the middle chunk.
Right, the longest part. About 50% of the script, maybe 60 pages or so.
So what happens here?
This is the struggle. The protagonist is now actively chasing their goal, But they're running into obstacles, conflicts, challenges, the stakes get higher. This is where you have all the rising action.
The tests, the setbacks.
Learning moments, failures, allies, enemies. It all happens in Act 2.
And right smack in the middle of this long act, Field put the midpoint, around page 60.
Yeah, roughly page 60. The midpoint is a really significant event. It often raises the stakes dramatically, maybe changes the hero's approach, or reveals crucial information. It often feels like a point of no return.
Things can't go back to the way they were before the midpoint.
Pretty much. You know, there's some debate about specific examples, like Michael Corleone deciding to kill Sollozzo and McCluskey in The Godfather. Some see that decision as plot point 1, pushing him into Act 2.
Right, committing him.
But then maybe the actual act of the killing, or him taking charge later in Sicily, functions like a midpoint event because it solidifies his transformation and drastically raises the stakes. It's about a major shift around the middle.
So it's a significant escalation point within Act 2.
Exactly. Act 2 keeps building that pressure, leading eventually to the next big turn. Plot point 2.
Which launches us into the final act. Act 3, resolution.
Back to about 25% of the script, the last 30 pages or so.
And the goal here is...
bring the main conflict to its head. This is where you have the climax, the ultimate showdown, the highest point of tension where the protagonist faces that final test. The big dramatic question gets answered: do they succeed or fail?
And after the climax, there's just a little bit left.
The denouement. It's brief. The immediate aftermath show the results of the climax, the new normal for the protagonist, tie up the main loose ends quickly.
Okay, so Act 1 sets it all up. Act 2 is the long road of conflict and rising stakes. Act 3 is the final confrontation and wrap-up. These page counts, though, 30, 60, 30, they're guides, right? Not strict rules.
Oh, absolutely guides. For proportion, for pacing, the key is understanding the function of each act. What job does it need to do for the story to feel right, to progress emotionally and logically?
Got it. And speaking of function, let's go back to those plot points. You said they were Field's most crucial innovation. He called them hinges. I like that. They swing the story open into the next section.
That's a perfect way to think about it. They are absolutely central to his model. They're not just random events. They are major incidents or revelations, often stemming from something the protagonist does or decides that fundamentally forces the story into a new direction. You can't get to Act 2 without plot point 1. You can't get to Act 3 without plot point 2.
So plot point 1, end of Act 1, around page 30, what's its specific job?
It slams the door on Act 1, on the ordinary world, and throws the protagonist headfirst into the main conflict of Act 2. Critically, it usually involves the protagonist making a conscious decision to engage, to pursue the goal. It's active.
Like Dorothy literally being swept away to Oz by the tornado? Okay. Maybe less active there, but then deciding to follow the yellow brick road? That's her commitment.
Right. Or Rick in Casablanca finally agreeing to help Laszlo escape. That decision locks him into the main drama.
And Michael Corleone deciding to carry out the assassination in The Godfather, that's his point of no return into the family business.
Exactly. A defining choice, launching him into the new reality of Act 2.
Then plot point 2, end of Act 2, around page 90. What does this hinge do?
This one spins the story into Act 3, into the final resolution. It's often a moment of major crisis. It could be a huge setback, a devastating reveal, maybe the protagonist's lowest point, what some call the all is lost moment.
Or maybe a key discovery.
Or a crucial discovery, yeah. Something that changes the game right before the end. It sets up the final confrontation.
Like Luke Skywalker finding out Vader is his father in Empire. Talk about a game-changing revelation right before the end of that chapter.
Precisely. Or think about Ripley finding the alien queen's egg chamber in Aliens. Suddenly, the mission isn't just survival, it's preventing galactic infestation. That discovery propels her into the final battle.
Or Andy Dufresne finally making his escape in Shawshank. That is the event. It ends the long struggle of Act 2 and pushes us directly into the resolution of his story.
Perfect example. These plot points ensure the protagonist is driving the story through their actions and the major events that happen to them, or because of them. It keeps things moving.
And that visual map Field created, the paradigm, helps you see that flow.
It really does. You can trace it. Ordinary world inciting incident shakes things up. Plot point I commits the hero, rising action and obstacles in Act 2. Midpoint escalation, more pressure, maybe a low point. Plot point 2 changes the game. climax denouement. It provides that skeleton.
A framework to build on. He even refined it later, didn't he? Added things like pinches.
He did, yeah.
Yeah.
Specifically to address that long stretch of Act 2, how do you keep the tension up? How do you keep the focus?
So pinch one, maybe around page 45?
Right. Usually an event that reminds the audience and the protagonist what's at stake. It often emphasizes the antagonist's power or applies some kind of pressure, keeps the conflict alive.
And pinch two later, maybe page 75.
Yeah, another jolt of pressure or reminder of the stakes. It often tightens the screws just before plot point 2 arrives, making the situation feel more desperate. Pinches help prevent that dreaded saggy middle in Act 2.
It's clear this structure stuff isn't just about plot mechanics, is it? It connects directly to character and how we feel the story. Field stressed that too, with ideas like character is action.
Hugely important for him. His point was, you reveal who a character truly is by what they do, especially under pressure. Think about those plot point decisions. What the character chooses to do in those moments tells you everything. Actions speak louder than words.
So the character's choices don't just turn the plot, they define the character simultaneously.
Exactly. And that ties into another key idea, the central question.
The big dramatic question hanging over the story.
Yes. It should be established pretty clearly in Act Y, usually linked to the protagonist's main goal. Will Luke destroy the Death Star? Will Michael keep his family safe without losing his soul? Will Andy escape Shawshank?
That question keeps the audience hooked, right? We need to know the answer.
Right. It creates that narrative tension that pulls you through the story all the way to the climax where it finally gets answered. It gives the whole journey focus.
Okay, so putting it all together, the 3 acts, the plot points as hinges, character revealed through action, the central question driving us forward. You can really see why this model works so well. Why did it resonate so strongly?
Well, multiple reasons. For writers, it provides that essential structure. Facing a blank page is terrifying. This gives you a map, a way to shape the story, prevent it from just wandering off.
Reduces the chaos.
And for the audience, that 3-act rhythm, those clear turning points, it just feels, right? It taps into a fundamental way humans process stories. Beginning, middle, end, with significant shifts along the way. Field basically codified that natural rhythm.
Makes it satisfying.
It does. And it emphasizes cause and effect, especially with the protagonist driving things at the plot points. Plus, as we discussed, it created that vital industry standard language.
Essential for pitching, development, collaboration.
Crucial. Everyone could get on the same page, literally and figuratively. All these factors together are why Field's framework became so dominant.
But like any hugely influential model, it's not without its critics. We should touch on that.
Definitely. It's important to see the limitations too. The biggest criticism is probably that it can be too formulaic.
If you follow it too slavishly.
Exactly. If everyone just plugs events into the page numbers inside an incident page 12, plot point I page 28, midpoint page 60, you risk getting predictable paint-by-numbers scripts.
The structure becomes obvious, a cage instead of a foundation.
Right. And related to that, the specific page numbers themselves, while helpful as guides for proportion, can feel arbitrary if treated like absolute rules. Forcing a plot point just because you hit page 90 might feel unnatural for that specific story.
And let's be honest, tons of great movies break these rules, right?
Oh, absolutely. Many brilliant, innovative films succeed precisely because they play with structure or use a different kind entirely. Physical fiction, Memento, lots of others. Field's model is powerful, but it's absolutely not the only way.
So understanding the tool means understanding its limits too.
That's critical thinking about craft, yeah. Knowing the rules is valuable. Knowing when and why you might bend or break them is just as important for creativity.
But still, you can't deny the legacy. It really did become, as some say, Hollywood's secret weapon.
For sure. Major screenwriters James Cameron, Judd Apatow, Tina Fey, they've all pointed to Field's book as being really important, especially early on. And producers, execs, they still use his terms constantly.
You hear it in meetings all the time. What's the plot point 2 here? Is the inciting incident strong enough?
It permeated the industry. And his work, it also paved the way for other screenwriting gurus who built on what he started.
Like Robert McKee, Blake Snyder with Save the Cat, John Truby.
Right. They took its foundational structure and maybe elaborated or shifted the emphasis. McKee goes deep into the philosophy of story. Snyder drills down into even more specific beats. Truby focuses more on character arcs and theme woven through structure. But they're all, in a way, standing on Field's shoulders.
It's amazing how one core idea can spark a whole ecosystem of thinking about storytelling.
And it's really crucial to remember Field's own perspective on this. He was aware of the formula criticism. He always stressed that the paradigm was meant to be a flexible tool.
A guide, not a rigid prescription.
Exactly, a foundation, not a cage. The structure has to serve the story you want to tell your characters, your themes, your voice. It's there to empower your creativity, give it clarity and impact, not to shut it down.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up with the big lesson from Field. That analogy you mentioned is great. Screenwriting, at its core, is telling stories with pictures.
And Field's insight was that structure is what gives you the power to do that well, clearly, dynamically, connecting emotionally with the audience.
So you need to learn the principles, understand why they generally work.
And then use that understanding as your launch pad to tell your story your way.
The dinosaur skeleton analogy really clicks. Sid Field's paradigm, the acts, the plot points, that's like the essential skeleton you see in a museum.
The fundamental bones, yeah. Giving the story its shape, its structure, its ability to stand up and move.
But it's the writer's job to add everything else that makes it unique and alive. The flesh, the skin, the heart, the soul.
The specific characters, the sharp dialogue, the resonant themes, the visual style. All the things that make this dinosaur different from every other one.
Before Field, it felt like writers were just digging for random bones sometimes.
Maybe hoping they'd stumble into a complete skeleton. Field gave them the blueprint for assembling it intentionally.
Yeah, it really made screenwriting feel like a craft you could actually learn, something you could practice and get better at. So the big takeaway from our deep dive today: Sid Field, through Screenplay and his paradigm, essentially gave screenwriters and Hollywood the blueprint. The three-act structure, the plot points as crucial hinges. It demystified the process, created a common language, and became the standard framework.
But crucially, as Field himself insisted, it's a flexible tool, a foundation to build upon, not a formula to blindly follow.
And hopefully understanding this framework, kind of seeing that skeleton underneath, gives you, the listener, a really powerful lens. You can look at movies differently now, appreciate the craft behind them more.
Whether you want to write or just love watching, you now have some language to talk about how stories are built, why certain moments land, how tension ramps up. You can see the architecture.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to chew on. Field himself said his model is a foundation, not a cage. And we know great stories often bend or break these rules. So what does that tell you about that tension, that balance between understanding the fundamentals of structure and finding your own unique, maybe even unconventional way to tell a truly compelling story? Where does structure empower creativity, and where might it limit it? Something to think about.